Now, this is a really unique program and it's designed to make you think. In fact, I have a couple of thoughts for everyone watching this to let orbit around in your brains and think about. So, how do you think that the space travel is going to affect these little tiny seeds? What are some of the ways that we can study that impact? Hmm, I think we're going to find out soon. So, when our little seed friends return from space, we get to see how they did on their journey. What we're going to do is check if they're viable. Now, viable means that the seeds are still alive and able to sprout and reproduce. If the seeds aren't viable, then they won't be able to grow into the big trees that we know. But if they are viable, we might be able to plant them and watch them grow. Now, I had a little chat earlier with my good friends, Cass, Kayla, and Marcus, and they told me some really interesting things about why we're sending seeds into space and what types of tree seeds are going and how the seeds are being protected during their orbit. That might help out their viability. So let's check out that conversation. We have the opportunity to sit with our scientists, and we're going to have a bunch of questions answered about trees and seeds. Super important stuff. So let's get right into it. All right, Cass, so let's start with you. I was wondering, could you please just tell us why we're doing this Moon Trees project?
Thanks, Amchat, for the question. We have a couple of reasons to complete our Moon Tree project. One certainly is to build upon the legacy of Stuart Roosa and that Apollo 14 Moon Trees project. Another is to begin the process of understanding how we can take seeds into space and make sure that they're viable and that they can survive. And this could have some implications for the future of human space travel and perhaps even how trees could play a role in exploration of space. And by planting moon trees around the country, we provide an opportunity for communities, for your hometowns, to have a tangible, living connection to space exploration. And hopefully, moon trees growing, maybe even on your own school campus, will encourage and inspire students like you to consider a career in science and technology, or maybe at least pursue innovation in any field of study you choose to follow.
All right, so let's check in with you, Marcus. Can you tell us what tree species were chosen for that Artemis 1 Moon Trees project, and why were those chosen?
Amchat, that's a really good question. There were 5 species that were selected. They were Douglas fir, loblolly pine, giant sequoia, American sycamore, and sweet gum tree. And these trees were selected because they're really well adapted to a broad range of environments across the U.S. They're also really representative of those forests that they occupy. In addition, some of the species had their seed come from more than one location in order to make sure that those seed were adapted to the specific locations that they'd be planted in. 4 of these species were part of the original Apollo 14 mission, and those were the loblolly pine, Doug fir, American sycamore, and sweet gum. So they kind of represent what we call a control. We know how they performed in the past, and we can kind of have an expectation of how they're going to, we would expect them to perform in the future.
Right. So, Kayla, I was curious. Was there some sort of like a pre-space flight training that these seeds to go through? No. More seriously, I'm just asking, how were they prepared to go into space? What was that packaging like?
Amchat, that's a great question, because preparing the seed to be traveling all the way to space is really important. Like Marcus mentioned, it's really important to think about the right seed in the right place. And so everybody who was participating in this coordinated with Cass and I to ship their seed to me here in Bend, Oregon. Once I received all the seed, I went through it and I was able to look at each individual lot, which is when we are talking about the loblolly in particular that came from the southeast of the US. I took that seed, sorted it all out into a tray, and then I put it in a machine we have at the extractory called a digital X-ray machine. That digital X-ray machine is really magical, and it allows me to see what's going on inside that seed coat and determine whether that seed has tissue that we think will become a tree. We're looking for 2 things. We're looking for this embryo, which is essentially the baby tree that's hidden inside of that seed. And that embryo is what's going to become a tree. We're also looking for the endosperm, which is what surrounds the embryo, and that's what's going to give it all its nutrients to become an actual green seedling. So think of a bean in your garden. Once that bean starts sprouting, that's when it turns green and it's able to work with sunlight to start creating its own nutrients. Until then, it's really important that there's an endosperm and an embryo in conjunction inside that seed. That's what we're looking for inside the X-ray. Once I was able to determine that all of the filled seed were separated from any potential empty seed, then I could start to package it so that it would safely travel to the moon. Here in Bend, we use a 6mm plastic, which means that the plastic bag we put our seed in is thin enough to support the seed and not take up a lot of space and be very bulky, but it's also thick enough so it doesn't allow a lot of moisture to go in and outside of that bag. You'll see photos of these seed raviolis as we talk about them. The seed is packaged inside each of those raviolis in equal proportions. So all those species that Marcus talked to you about and the species that came from multiple locations across those ranges are represented in each segment of the ravioli, because we know that space is limited on that rocket ship, and it's really important for the astronauts to be able to modify what's in their payload. So they can just take and cut one of those raviolis and shorten the length of seed headed up to the moon if they needed to. So the packaging we use for seed storage is really important. Like I mentioned, we don't want a lot of moisture to go into the package or out of the package. So these seed were dried down to a level that allows them to be dormant. So essentially the seed are just in a state of taking a nap, and they're hanging out in the rocket ship, and they'll make their travels underneath a seat, probably underneath the captain's seat, and then they'll come back down where then we can put them into our nursery system, and we can spark those seed and wake them up, and they will start to germinate and create.
Wow, that is a lot of work. Now, how did this preparation help to maintain seed viability? Oh, and just to remind the folks who are at home, since we're using this term so much, viable means alive and still able to sprout and reproduce.
That's true, AmChat. That's a great definition of what is viable. Within the Forest Service, we work a lot with various seed, and it's so important to package the seed so that it stays viable, because that's how we can be successful in all of our efforts on the ground. When we think about viable seed, a couple things that are really important is the seed is dry, and it's kept dry because moisture starts to harbor mold. And we've found that if we can keep seed dry in the appropriate packaging, it can store in a freezer for up to 50 years and still be viable.
Wow, that was really interesting, Kayla. And perhaps folks in the audience will have even more questions about seeds and viability. We'll see.
The seed is awesome.